This is the St. Joseph's School in Menominee County. The children who go to school here are Menominees. They're descendants of the woodland people we've been talking about. Today, the schooling of these boys and girls is very much like the schooling of boys and girls in all parts of Wisconsin. But what about 300 years ago? What about during the time before the white settlers had come to Wisconsin from Europe? What was their education like then? Well, that's one of the things we'll be talking about today.
Hi. Remember last time we talked about some of the first groups of people to live in Wisconsin. One of those groups was the Menominees. We saw that they and the other woodland tribes lived in small villages that were usually built near waterways. Their homes were bark and reed wigwams. They got their food by hunting, by fishing, and by gathering wild rice. And they made all the other things they needed from materials they found in the surrounding woodlands. As Menominee boys and girls grew up, they learned to help their parents do those things. But their education included much more, too. With me today to talk about that is Queso, a man of the Menominee tribe. Queso, can you tell me what else a 9 or 10-year-old learned?
Yeah, right in that age again, 8, 9, 10, then as parents looked at these children, they were reaching that age when they ought to take maybe the first step towards manhood or girlhood, you know.
At 10 years old?
Yeah, well, yes. There was a lot of things that you'd be surprised. When you're living back in the woods, you'd be surprised how much you had to learn, you know, to reach or in that age of 10 years. And, of course, again, survival comes in, but there was so much things that you picked up during that age. And then again, the parents thought you're old enough now to start on your fasting. Fasting was one of the greatest things that Indian had. And so they prepared these young people for fasting purposes, you know, and educating them, showing them what they ought to do and, you know, routines of it, you know. And so...
Why would they want the children to fast?
Well...
You mean go for days without eating food?
Yes. There's so many Indian stories that was hand-me-down that would clearly describe the reasons, but just for our purpose here now, I could say, summarize it like this here. Young children were required to go fast. Now, the younger ones wasn't required to go way back, back in the woods, you know. They were within a shouting distance or, you know, like that, where they could hear their mother. The mother had to have them, you know, for some reason. And these children would go out and they would fast, just like the older people, but at least they wasn't required to go a long ways, you know, and they were told not to go without food. And if they did partake any food, well, then they broke the fast. They would have to come back, camp, and mother would feed it again.
What were they supposed to learn from doing that?
Well, of course, in the Indian, again, the spirits were a vital part of Indian life, you know, and Indian was, by nature, I guess I would say they were religious, you know. They depended quite a bit on the spirit. So they would go out in the wilderness and talk with the spirit.
Would several children get together and have a kind of class, or was it always one person and his parent?
No, the kids got together and they did things. One would show the other, yes. And sometimes a girl, for example, would be gifted maybe making things, you know. And after the other kids, how'd you make it, you know? What you do, what you use, you know, that stuff. And they would gather in little gatherings and help one another. Sure. So nowadays, when you think of even an accredited university like here at Green Bay, you got a wonderful school here, buildings, you know, and it's a university. And but in Indian term, again, we had a university too, and we call it the real hard knocks, you know. which you learn awful quick, and you had to be accurate, you know.
And the teachers were the parents who knew how to
Yes.
to do these things. Already.
Yes. And for example, if you fell in a lake, you know, this time of the year, ice, you know, what would you do, you know, like that? Well, they taught those things, you know. It happened to people, Indian people, and so they were taught how to survive, you know, and, what to do, you know, in case emergencies and so on. And maybe all the time, maybe it didn't work, but at least you tried it, you know. And so people were a long ways apart, but you did the best you could, you know, like. Well, all these things was taught from 8, 7, 8, you know, 9 on up, you know. And the older you got, well, the more experience you got, you know, the more was required of you.
What about Menominee children today? The schooling is a lot different, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, I would say the school is modern now, even comparing it to when I went to school.
This is one of the schools that Queso was talking about. You can see that the schooling now is much different from what he described. But you know, the way that Menominee kids get their education today is only one of many things that have changed for the Menominees. For example, Menominee people don't live in wigwams anymore. They live in houses and in apartment buildings. They don't make their living by hunting and food gathering anymore either. They have jobs of many different kinds.
Why are things so different now? Why have things changed so much for the Menominees? Well, the story begins in the 1600s, not long after the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. A number of people, strangers to the woodland tribes, began to arrive in Wisconsin. They came from another continent, Europe. Do you know who this man was? He was Jean Nicolet. He came from France, and he arrived at the southern shore of Green Bay in 1634 while exploring in the Great Lakes area. The people living in the Green Bay area at that time, the Winnebagos, were very surprised to meet Nicolet. He was the first European they had ever seen. But within a few years, they would meet many more Europeans from France. Most of these Frenchmen came to Wisconsin for one reason. What do you think that reason was? Well, maybe this will give you a clue. This model shows a building that one Frenchman built when he came here. It is like many others that were built by the French in the Wisconsin woodlands. What do you think it was used for? Well, let's look inside. Maybe we can find out. Along one wall, he has stored some blankets and other kinds of cloth. He also has a number of iron objects in here, like these kettles, axes, and traps. All of these articles were made in Europe. What do you think he is going to do with them? Would you say that he plans to trade them? Well, that's exactly what he plans to do. And that is the reason why he and the other Frenchmen came to Wisconsin. They came to trade. These are some of the things they brought from Europe. As we look at them, think about how a person could use them. Can you tell what this is? It's a very useful tool. It was good for doing many different things. It's an axe. Another useful trade item was this, a brass kettle. And of course, a very valuable tool for the Menominees was this, a musket. And also this, a trap that was used for capturing bear. Items that weren't quite as useful as those things, but which were still very popular, were these. Beads of many different kinds and many different colors. Another popular trade item that wasn't especially useful came in jars like this one. Any idea what the stuff inside this jar might be? It was liquor, like brandy and rum. Now, can you see how these things would change the way the Menominees lived? Instead of hunting, for example, with a bow and arrow, the Menominee could use a gun or a trap. And in place of the old birch bark macucks that they made by hand, they could use kettles like this. And instead of making beads out of bone or pieces of shells, they could buy them, ready-made in Europe. This means that many of the old jobs were no longer necessary. Instead of making the things they needed, they just bought them from the men who owned the trading posts. This was the first great change in the Menominees' lives. Now, the Menominees bought a lot of things from the French. What do you think they used to pay them? Well, tell me this. What did the Indians have which the Europeans wanted? The French wanted furs, especially the skins of the beaver, the mink, the otter, the muskrat, and other animals. They wanted to sell these furs back home in Europe to people who would make them into clothing. Of course, the Menominees had plenty of furs to give them. The Wisconsin forests were crowded with fur-bearing animals, and the Menominees were able to sell thousands upon thousands of fur bundles like this one. The guns and the traps the Menominees got from the traders made it easy for them to capture animals. And soon, large numbers of people got involved in the trading. It was from places like this throughout Wisconsin that the French took their furs home to Europe. And it was here, too, that the Menominees and the other tribes got the things they needed. The trading posts became almost like supermarkets are today. Now, as time went on, another change began to happen because of the trade. The Menominees began to depend more and more on the traders for everything that they needed. Before long, all over Wisconsin, families began to move close to the trading posts to make their permanent homes. In just a few years, the old way of life disappeared. Now, the changes we've talked to up to this point were caused by the fur traders. After them came other groups of people. These people caused more changes for the Menominees. Have you any idea who these new groups were? These are some of the cabins they built when they got to Wisconsin. Who do you think would build something like this? They were settlers, people who came from Europe and the eastern United States. They wanted to live here permanently and to raise families. Why would this cause changes for the Menominees? Well, for one thing, the settlers wanted land. The Menominees and the other Wisconsin tribes began giving up their land, sometimes because they wanted to, but often because they were forced to. Some tribes lost all of their land and moved out of Wisconsin completely. The Menominees ended up keeping just a small part of the land they once had. What was left for them was a small area along the Wolf River. It was called a reservation. Listen to what Queso has to say about his people going to the reservation.
Indians always did live in this area, a group that was down around Lake Poygan, Oshkosh, and through that area, Appleton, Fox River Valley. The Army made them move up here. These Indians were forced to paddle their way up Wolf River. Fall rains and all that had already settled in, making the water quite high. And these people done that with their families, and old people, grandparents and that. A lot of older people, they couldn't make it. There's a lot of people drowned. A lot of Indian people drowned along the way. Boats tipped over and they couldn't save some of the children. When they landed at Kashina, the Catholic convert landed on the north bank of Kashina, the present village of Kashina. And that priest that was along with a missionary opened a mission there and got a village started that way.
On the reservation, the U.S. government ruled the Menominees, but it did not much more than rule them. It tried to change them, tried to make them live like the Yankee and European settlers lived. One way the government tried to do this was to put the children in schools. Here they were taught the subjects that Yankee and European children were taught. They were not allowed to speak their own Menominee language or to learn the things that their parents once taught them. Another way the government tried to change them was to teach the Menominees how to be farmers, like the settlers were. But the Menominees had never been farmers before, and they were not very good at it. Besides, the soil on the reservation was not good for farming. So many families continued to hunt and fish for their food. Living like this on the reservation looks hard, doesn't it? It was. The Menominees were very poor in their first few years on the reservation, and life continued like this for a long time. But after about 50 years, the situation began to improve. The Menominees have a great forest on their land. With help from the U.S. government, they built a sawmill and went into the lumber business.
As a boy growing up here, my attitude about the mill was if I went to Neopet and saw a lot of logs piled up, I knew we were making money. I didn't know how it was made, where it came from, or how dollars wound up where. But if I saw a lot of logs, we were making money. If I saw no logs, I got concerned.
The lumber business was good for the Menominees. People got jobs at the mill, and at last, some money began coming in to the tribe. In 1961, the U.S. government decided that the Menominees should rule themselves. It passed a law to make the Menominee Reservation into Menominee County. Now, so far, we've talked only about the way the Menominees have lived in the past. What about life in Menominee County today? What is it like for a boy or girl to live there now? Well, to find out, I went to Menominee County and talked to a number of boys and girls at the St. Joseph School.
My favorite sport is football. I usually play at my house.
My favorite sport is fishing. Go fishing with my brother and go fishing with my mom and dad and go fishing at Legend Lake and Sand Lake.
My favorite sport is basketball. I go downtown back to Rec Center and there's a couple of basketball courts there.
On Saturday, we usually wash and clean up the house, and on Sunday we get up and go to church, and then we come home and we set the table and ready to eat.
I get up, watch cartoons, go outside, feed the rabbits and dogs, come in, put our stuff away and go outside, play baseball, and sometimes go up on top of the hill and play around.
In the summertime, we usually go swimming in the morning, and after we get done swimming, we go back by the apple orchard and pick apples.
I'm gonna go to the 4-H camp in Crivets, and at that 4-H camp in Crivets, we go on nature hikes, and we have excavation. We have a bell for us. First in the morning we get up, we have to say our pledge allegiance to the flag, and then when we get done eating in the afternoon, we have to take a nap, and then after our nap, we go swimming, and after swimming, we go on our nature hikes.
In the summertime, best thing I like to do is swim.
Belong to a 4-H club, and then we bake and make things and go on hikes.
I can go swimming and fishing and climb on big rocks and work at the dells and visit other people and see other people that come up to the dells and make new friends and go to Camp Bird and play football and baseball.
That gives you an idea of how boys and girls in Menominee County spend their time. Is it like the way you spend time? Is it different? Think about it.
This summer, I'm going to go to a basketball camp in Milwaukee.
At Camp Bird, we do arts and crafts, and we have a little piece of paper. We have to do it and follow the schedule. But sometimes we have to take a swimming test, whether you're going to be a beginner or intermediate or a swimmer. Then we, at nighttime, if it's kind of hot, we go swimming again, or whether we can stay in a rec center and do arts and crafts, or whether we play baseball or basketball or something.
My favorite sport is fishing. I go fishing with my dad and my brother up to South Branch.
After school, I go up to the courthouse to wait for my mother. And we stay there till 5 o'clock.
On Sunday, I usually, on Sunday I read the comics, and sometimes I ride my bike, watch TV, go to bed then.